Charlie Goldsmith, do you think they could have fit 2 people on the plank in the Titanic?
I haven't seen Titanic.
Okay, neither have I. Neither have I. To be fair, neither have I. But I figure, could Leo DiCaprio have fit on that plank? Elliot seems to think yes.
I think he could have, Charlie. I think he could have. I think they both could have lived.
I'm very confident, Elliot. You've put a lot of time breaking this down, so I'm going to trust your expertise.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
Charlie, thanks for coming on today. I want to ask you first. So yesterday on the show, we were sitting here talking about the joint practice and everything, and we were asking, what do you expect? What do you want to see? Anything like that? And I sat here and I said, look, isn't a joint practice just an excuse for 2 teams to fight? And then 15 minutes into practice, we start seeing you tweet about those guys throwing punches or whatever it was. We see all the video. Things got out. There was a skirmish, maybe a couple of skirmishes. Can you just kind of review the joint practice yesterday? What happened? Any observations you might have that you didn't tweet out or anything like that?
I think the big takeaway and kind of the fight helped back this up was if there was any question about whether or not the Bengals defense would have the same edge to it that really defined it last year. Even though they've lost Jesse Bates and Von Bell and Eli Apple, that edge is stronger than ever. Ask Elton Jenkins how big that edge is. The defense, a couple veterans told me yesterday, was one of the best practices by Bengals defense in this era of Bengals football, in this Lou Anarumo, Zach Taylor era. The best practice I've seen from DJ Reader, from Mike Hilton. Trey Hendrickson took over the practice. Sam Hubbard was all over the place. The speed in the secondary, Dax Hill and Nick Scott aced their test, and the best chance we'll have to evaluate them before the start of the season. So there are some questions. The story of the season might be how well does the new look Bengals secondary play, and the first kind of sign they got to show that couldn't have gone anywhere.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about the secondary. Overall, your impressions here over the first couple of weeks of training camp and now going into the first preseason game tomorrow, it's been impressive to you?
Yeah, so Dax and Nick won't be Jesse and Vaughn right away. Jesse and Vaughn weren't even Jesse and Vaughn right away. It was rockier in 2020, really heated up into the 2021 postseason and took off after that. Again, probably Dax and Nick aren't like their ratings on a scale of 1 to 100 wouldn't be as high as Jesse and Vaughn right now, but they're faster and they're more versatile. Like, for example, Jesse Bates was usually the one who would line up deep down the field just because Vaughn's speed and his range weren't necessarily his strengths. I do think Dax and Nick are more interchangeable than Jesse and Vaughn were. I think they can do kind of more similar things, which will give Lou Anarumo more creativity or ability to be creative. Dax Hill's playmaking probably is better than Jesse and Vaughn's playmaking. He keeps making pass breakups over the middle of the field. Nick Scott is like if Cam Taylor-Britt were a safety. He is this hard hitter, physical presence, also with lights out speed to track guys down the field. So again, they'll have to answer questions throughout the season, but I don't think the Bengals could have asked for more for where those 2 guys are at right now.
We haven't had you on since Logan Wilson signed his extension, but you're talking about the secondary, Jesse Bates, these guys, and you look at Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, and a couple of guys that the Bengals signed for the same amount of money combined that Jesse Bates is playing for under his own contract himself. Does that speak to what the Bengals prioritize and their value and what we thought about this contract situation the whole time, or what's your take on that?
I think that there was a contract offer that they thought was very fair to Jesse Bates that Jesse didn't see eye to eye with, and that's totally his right. He's doing great financially in Atlanta right now. I think the Bengals would have loved to have had Jesse to continue to play that role on the back end of the Bengals defense. But, one of the good problems to have when you have too many players to keep is there are other players you can sign to value contracts. I didn't expect them to be able to keep Jermaine and Logan specifically because of how the linebacker market took off during the offseason. I'm frankly really surprised that the Bengals have them both on contracts that are so low. Some teams are paying linebackers what Logan and Jermaine are making combined. And to have that in the middle of your defense for the next 3 years, it's everything that Lou Anarumo could want.
Looking at this contract situation, and, everybody wants to know about Joe Burrow. Everybody wants to know about the receivers. But the Bengals payroll is gradually starting to go north. And as it goes north and they start to shell out more and more money, do you think the goal of re-signing this offense and getting the core of this offense, the receiving, the receivers, Joe Burrow, these guys. Do you think that that's still a realistic goal?
I think that's always been their plan and their priority. Like, here's a fun way to think about it. I don't think when Logan signed his contract, they went, sorry, T, no more resources available. Have a good rest of your career. I think there's a lot of confidence in T. Higgins' future with the Bengals still. And that's just what these coaches and this front office has done historically. Look throughout Bengals history, the Bengals have invested in multiple wide receivers, with early draft picks before free agency really took off. But then they always had, Chad and Hushmanzada, and they invested in AJ, and then they invested a lot in the receivers around AJ. They invested in Jamar and T, and I think they'll do it again. Look at Zach Taylor. He came from an LA team that invested the second most resources kind of in its era towards the wide receivers they had. Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, there was one more guy in there. The only team that invested more in their receivers in that era was the mid-2010s Denver Broncos. Their quarterbacks coach was a guy named Brian Callahan. That was like the Brandon Marshall era in Denver. These guys believe in investing in multiple receivers. That is what they do. That's who they've been, and I don't see that changing.
How has the offense looked here over the last couple of weeks? We saw Joe Burrow at practice yesterday. Obviously wasn't practicing, but for the first time since he had been carted off the field, we actually saw him out there on the practice field. How have things progressed without him under center at practice?
So I'll start with the receivers. Jamar and T look better than they've ever been. They're more versatile, more athletic. They talk about wanting to move around more. They talk about wanting to play a greater percentage of the snaps and the training that they've done to put themselves in that position. Jamar looks even better at contested catches. They've found ways to get the ball in his hands, take advantage of yards after catch. T. Higgins has just added to his route tree. He's lining up in the slot more. He's taking advantage of, undersized slot corners he might be going up against like he did, or like he can throughout the season. And, and Jones and Yoshivasha are exactly what the Bengals hope they'd be. The line, Frank Pollock is not a warm guy that, he's an offensive line coach. I've seen him multiple times after practice go up to the line and say, great job today. That's exactly what I was looking for. So that's good. Irv Smith's more of a question mark. They're finding ways to kind of what routes work best for him. I think they really want to see him over the middle of the field, kind of in the square, I like to call it, between the linebackers and the safeties. They're figuring some stuff out. Quarterback play hasn't been great. Simeon and Browning continue to compete. I lean towards Browning right now, but like even among us, writers who are watching all the practice, that's a split opinion. Big preseason for those guys. They haven't been accurate. They haven't been the most aggressive and consistent in throws down the field. They haven't been as sharp in the red zone as you'd like. Obviously, all of those issues get solved when Joe Burrow returns.
Yeah, I've said for a long time, and you look at backup quarterbacks and their value to a team, and I think sometimes the backup quarterback gets undervalued because you just assume and you hope that your franchise quarterback and the most important piece of not only your team but your city and your culture and everything else, that your quarterback is going to be the mainstay of your team for the length of the season. But God forbid he goes down with an injury, you hope that whoever replaces him is able to still carry a very talented team through the rest of the year. Now, Jamar Chase last week comes onto the NFL Network, and he starts to give these quotes, which I didn't personally buy. I think he knows what he's saying. I think maybe there's a little bit of gamesmanship there. He's stirring the crowd up. But, we talk here a lot how a lot of times in humor there's a little sliver of truth, and that maybe Jamar is sitting there saying to himself, look, I don't want Joe to go out there and re-injure himself in week 1 against the Cleveland Browns. But the Bengals can't punt on week 1 against the Browns and a divisional opponent and start like they did last year. And then, oh, by the way, still hope that they get the number 1 seed. Where were you on the fence there, Charlie, with what Jamar said last week and how that whole situation's kind of going down right now?
I mean, he was reflecting on his own experience, and he was completely right. Sitting out that extra week helped him be even more prepared. He had a massive game against the Chiefs when he had that first week back. He was Jamar Chase again, full go, and that meant a lot, as then he was ready to take over down the stretch and make probably one of the toughest catches of his career in 10-degree weather in the AFC Championship game against Kansas City. With Burrow will be out there when this isn't an update, but he'll be out there when he's ready to be out there, and he knows himself very well. And there is a specific process, a specific rehab process they're going through. I know that players play through calf strains more than you would think. So that is a sign of kind of the overall scope of the injury and where Burrow can be. I've heard no concern. This very easily, from the minute he got hurt, could have had a very different tone, and that tone just hasn't been the case at all, as people, publicly and privately have been talking about Burrow.
I was going to ask you that. Do you think if this had happened in the AFC Championship game, he'd have played in the Super Bowl?
Joe Burrow finished the Super Bowl, I believe, with a sprained MCL. We don't talk about that enough, but he did, and he almost threw a 60-yard game-winning touchdown to Jamar Chase over Jalen Ramsey. So,
yeah,
Joe Burrow would play through. Yeah.
That's kind of the sense that I got, that when you go down, obviously you're taking these precautions. You go outside, practice is 100 degrees. You have that sleeve on your leg. You don't want to do anything that overextends yourself or puts you at any risk going forward. But I think that the Bengals understand their position this year as opposed to last year, and the importance of that number 1 seed this year, and what they can do to put themselves in a spot to get that by starting strong. When Thom sits up here and makes the point about playing your starters in the preseason, now you're not going to go out there and you're going to play your starters the entire game. We get that. But last year, with a revamped offensive line, we didn't see them at all in the preseason, and they didn't look great until a few weeks in when they started to get that cohesiveness together. Do you anticipate the same thing? Now, I know there's not as many new pieces, but do you anticipate the Bengals handling the preseason the same way this year?
All right, so 2021, they started 3-1. There was no slow start. 2022, they started 0-2, obviously, big story there.
Yep.
Who started slow, though? Let's break it down. The defense was the stat I'm forgetting, but they didn't allow a second-half touchdown for the first 7 weeks of the season or something crazy like that. The defense came out rolling. They were firing on all cylinders for the start of the season. They did not start slow. Jamar Chase, I think the third best game I've ever seen from him, behind 2 other games that come to mind. Third best game I've ever seen from him was the Steelers game week 1. He was ready. T. Higgins was ready. Tyler Boyd was ready. Hayden Hurst made a great first impression. He was ready. Joe Mixon had his most explosive run of the year in week 1. He was ready. Who was not ready? I think the people who were not ready were Burrow. He had an appendectomy. He couldn't have played in the preseason anyway. And the 2 tackles. Jonah Williams, he struggled. That's its own thing. But Lyle Collins didn't practice at all in training camp due to a back injury. So of the 3 and I thought the interior of the offensive line was fine in the first 2 weeks of the season. Not great, but Kappa was also hurt during training camp. It was fine. Out of the 3 people I really think started slow, 2 of them couldn't have played in the preseason anyway. So I think the overall sample size shows that you don't need to play in the preseason. You just have to be healthy during training camp and get the work in you need to get in that more controlled setting. Also, where you can control different situations and work more on red zone, third down, all that kind of stuff. I don't think slow starts have had any connection to what the Bengals have done in the preseason.